How much performance can you squeeze into a compact $2,000 PC build? Surprisingly, quite a lot. I mean, this thing has an RTX 4080 Super packed inside it, and it can pretty much run anything. Not to mention, the temperatures are completely fine, and it's all packed into this super tiny, ultra premium ITX case. Let me show you how to build it. Now, I actually want to start with the PC case this time around because it really is one of the highlights for this build, and it's the formed T1 V2.5. For just $10 more than the Fractal Terror, it is more compact, more space optimized on the inside, and the build quality is truly insane. Easily the highest quality PC case that is out there. The anodized finish is super smooth, and the attention to detail when you look at this machining, it is just next level. This is their new gunmetal color, which has a nice soft blue tint to it, which I personally really like, but it also comes in black or silver if you prefer those instead. This does actually come flat packed though, so we do need to assemble it, which is one of the downsides, but it's not too difficult, and it is kind of satisfying, honestly, putting it all together. First, we join the front and rear panel with the two side beams. All of the case screws, by the way, are identical for this new updated model, which makes things really easy. Next is the top beam. Lots of different screw points here, as you can see. The one that I'm installing it into actually allows for a 3.25 slot GPU, but I later moved that one screw over to the 3-slot position. This is one of the really cool things about the T1. You can actually move that center column to allow for more or less CPU or GPU clearance, depending on what components you're using. Then we have the backplate, which is what our motherboard will lock into. 3 screw points here. We have one at the bottom, one at the top from the inside, and then another which screws directly into that center spine piece. Then we have the GPU riser beam, which mounts with one screw to the backplate. We then connect it to one of the side beams with this 40mm standoff. You can just hand tighten it at one side and then lock it in with the other. And then we have our 5mm motherboard standoffs, our power supply bracket, and that's pretty much it for now. As for the components, let's start with the CPU. And here I've actually gone with the $200 i5-14400F from Intel. Of course, if money was no object, I'd just go for the fastest CPU at the moment, which is the 7800X3D, at least as far as gaming is concerned, but it is just too expensive for this budget. Instead, I've gone for the much cheaper i5, which allows us to budget for a much faster GPU. And this thing is still 10 cores, can clock up to 5 GHz. I really doubt we'll see any bottlenecking, but I guess we're about to find out. Since this is a non-overclockable CPU as well, we don't really need to overspend on a Z790 motherboard. Here I've gone with B760 instead, specifically this ITX model from Gigabyte, which is surprisingly still pretty stacked. We have 6 USB ports, with one of them being Type-C. We have Wi-Fi 6, huge heat sinks with an integrated heat pipe all the way around, and 2 M.2 slots with one of those being on the back. $190 for this thing is a pretty solid deal, and it is the DDR5 version as well. Speaking of which, DDR5 is getting much more affordable these days, and you might as well go for it unless you're on a super constrained budget. I've gone for this 32GB 6400 MHz CL34 kit from G.Skill, which was only about $120. To be honest, anything much faster than this, and you kind of start running into compatibility issues. Kits over 7000 MHz, for example. This, on the other hand, should be super stable with just one click in the BIOS. Now, the 14400F CPU only has a 65 watt TDP, which means cooling should be pretty straightforward. My first option here would have been the Alpenphone Blackridge, which I've used over and over again, but it just doesn't fit on this board or with this socket. So instead, I've gone with the IS47XT from ID Cooling. I've never used this before, but the reviews seem pretty positive. Seems very dense and high quality too, so fingers crossed. Mounting is pretty conventional. We have a backplate, we've got some spacers. Make sure to use the LGA 1700 specific ones for this build. Then we've got some brackets, some thermal paste, and then just some more screws to lock it down. Plug that into the fan header on the top left, and that is all ready to go. For storage, I've gone with a single 1TB M.2 NVMe drive. This one is the Samsung 980, which you can pick up for about $80. You can step up to the 980 Pro if you're doing like content creation and large media transfers and stuff like that. It's an extra $20, but for most people, for most gaming builds, this is totally fine. You also have that second rear slot on the motherboard if you want to add more storage down the road. Now, for the power supply, I've gone with the SP750 from Lee & Lee. The main reason being that my first choice, which is the Corsair SF750 Platinum, it is discontinued here in Australia, and I just cannot buy it. This Lee & Lee unit will handle our components just fine. It comes with nice sleeved cables and it's pretty affordable, but the fan curve on this unit I've just found to be a bit more sporadic than what I found with Corsair. So yeah, if you can still get the Corsair SF750 in your region, that would be my first pick, but I will link both of them down below. At this point, you'll also want to install the power extension cable. You have 2 screws at the back, and then you just plug it right into the power supply. This unit does require a bit of a stretch. Next up, we have our riser cable for the GPU, which is a little bit tricky. You'll want to remove the top 2 motherboard screws, carefully feed the riser through there, and then lock it into the PCIe slot. Then screw the motherboard back down, and then screw the riser in at the bottom with 2 more screws. And at this point, we are ready for the main event, which is of course the 4080 Super. There are a few different models here that will fit inside the T1, the Founders Edition model included, although you will need a custom power cable for that one to work. The one that I've picked up is actually pretty compact, at least by 4080 Super standards. It is the Zotac Trinity. It's also one of the models that you'll frequently see around that $1,000 MSRP, or at least really close to it. Installation is pretty straightforward. There's no special maneuvering required or anything like that. Just lock it into the riser, install the connecting bracket with 3 screws, and then plug it into the included triple 8-pin adapter. Definitely double check to make sure that adapter is fully seated and latched onto the connector, and then from there, just a bit of cable management to tidy things up. And for the very last component, I'm adding 2 exhaust fans at the top to help with cooling, which I definitely recommend for a compact build like this. Thought I'd go for some RGB as well this time around, just to help spice things up a little bit. These Mobius 120Ps from Cooler Master seem really well reviewed, and they don't need any special modules or hubs to get working. Just plug them right into the board. I did need to press the power supply extension cable down quite a bit and use zip ties as well to get that second fan installed. It is a pretty tight fit, but it is totally possible. But after that, we are completely finished. This is our super premium, super compact, and also super fast mini PC. So I've built in the T1 a handful of times now, and I've got to say it doesn't get any less rewarding. The result here is just an incredibly dense, glowing monster on the side of your desk, taking up no space at all, at the same time delivering an insane amount of performance. Speaking of which, we've got Helldivers 2 here running at 1440p on this OLED monitor. I'm running it on the high preset as well. Frame rates are pretty decent, above 100 FPS. And then in terms of temperatures, 4080 Super running around 70 degrees flat, and that 14400F is running really nicely in the mid 70s, pulling barely any power at all. This was all at a room temperature as well, at around 24 degrees. In Furmark, I was able to push that 4080 Super above 300 watts, which you're not going to see in many games out there, but if they do, as you can see, this system will be totally fine there too. Pretty typical Windows setup as well. I used fan control as usual to dial in some of the fan curves. It's really basic stuff here, which I'll leave a link down below. Totally free software, which I recommend. And then XMP for the memory was just one click to get that running at 6400 megahertz with all the correct timings. And I'll also mention the CPU, despite it saying it's a 65 watt TDP, it actually runs beyond that on this motherboard. It actually runs completely unlocked, which is kind of cool. You get a little bit more performance. In Cinebench, for example, at full load, I was seeing it at around 100 watts, with the temperatures actually being okay too on that tiny 47mm cooler. Speaking of which, I did actually rotate that CPU cooler heatsink 90 degrees just to work a little bit better with those top fans. This way, with those heatsink fins pointing towards that top fan and getting a little bit more airflow, we should have more cooling potential compared to before where it was a bit blocked. Also, these RGB Cooler Master fans seem pretty decent as well. I've set them to around 60% once the GPU hits full load, and yeah, they're really not that loud at all. They also use a daisy-chained RGB connector, which is pretty neat. That means you only need one RGB header on your motherboard, which is typically all we get with ITX. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, for $2,000 bucks, I personally would not build anything else.